If we were honest with ourselves, we would recognize that most of us aren't the best at discerning what we truly need. Or if we do recognize our needs, we aren't always the best at fulfilling them. Take drinking water, for example. That is a basic necessity of life. And yet, when I was in seminary, I often swapped water for sweet tea until eventually I had to go to the university clinic because I was so dehydrated. And they put me on, I guess, a saline drip or something. Yeah, and of course I didn't learn my lesson because 6 years later, I had to go to the emergency room because of severe abdominal pain. And that abdominal pain was most likely caused by kidney stones. There are various factors that contribute to the formation of kidney stones, and guess what? One of them is dehydration. Now, of course, I'm doing a bit better at meeting my needs, but yeah, back to the point. We as humans aren't always good at 1, discerning our needs, and 2, if we somehow manage to figure out what we need, we aren't always good at meeting them. In John chapter 4, verses 5 to 42, there's a lot of discussion about water and food. And yet, Jesus points to deeper needs. Jesus tells the Samaritan woman, who is astonished that Jesus would ask her, of all people, for a drink of water, that he had living water. And access to this living water was not based on shallow divisions that pit people against each other, nor was he going to judge her for living with multiple men in order to survive. Jesus was pointing to another reality, and he was urging her to turn to him to fulfill her deeper need for liberation, a need neglected by dominant society. Jesus also encourages his disciples to look deeper, to look beyond physical food and to notice the ways in which God is at work around them. He encourages them to notice that God is ready to act in the world then and now, if only they could truly see and obey God. Jesus is telling them to notice how God is seeking to fulfill humanity's deeper needs for justice, for salvation, for liberation. Now, let me be clear. Meeting basic needs is super important, as my personal story with dehydration proves. In addition, the reality is that so much of the world is struggling to meet basic needs through no fault of their own. Access to food and water are justice issues, and they matter. I don't mean to ignore those issues and subordinate them to spiritual concerns. I would argue that in this day and age, access to drinking water and healthy food is tied to spiritual concerns that are often neglected. For example, if we looked at those responsible for preventing others from accessing basic needs, what would we find? If we, for example, looked at the giant corporations that are polluting water sources, that are extracting water from vulnerable communities only to sell them at prices that are unaffordable and to ship them off to those who can afford them, what would we discover? If we look at politicians who believe providing free food and a safety net is beyond our means, what might we discover? It's easy to write off those who are doing harm just as evil and whose only motivations are hatred and greed. And don't get me wrong, those motivations can be very powerful. But let's nuance the conversation a bit. What if those causing harm, such as the corporations polluting and extracting water, the politicians denying aid to the vulnerable, are acting not only out of greed or hatred, but also out of ignorance regarding their needs? For instance, one could argue that these corporations and politicians don't recognize this reality, that we're all interdependent, and that what directly impacts one will eventually have consequences for all. The corporations that only see their need for more money and who act in harmful ways are either unaware or do not care that their actions will eventually circle back and impact them. I mean, lack of water or polluted water impacts everyone and will have devastating consequences for us all. These politicians and corporations are ignoring the deeper needs that they have, as well as that we all have as a human race, and are focusing on short-term needs and wants, and not recognizing that their inability to dig deeper, metaphorically of course, is going to have devastating consequences for us all. In this passage, Jesus points to the Samaritan woman and his disciples to look beyond their present desires and needs to something more. He encourages them to look deeper and turn to God to fulfill their deeper needs. Needs for God, for liberation, for eternity. In a similar way, we humans need to look deeper than short-term wants and needs. Let's be honest, many of these short-term needs really are just wants. And our inability to recognize those deeper needs often leaves us chasing solutions that only cause us and other people harm. Let's be honest and willing to explore our deepest needs, trusting that God will help us to fulfill them.